Alright, today we're going to look at the Gulf War, also known as the Persian Gulf War. This was between two different sides. You had the US-led coalition of 35 to 42 countries versus the country of Iraq. Here's some random key terms. So what started this conflict? Well, the conflict starts with the Iraqi invasion of Kuwait. You can see in the bottom right here the size difference between the two countries. And there's a couple different motivations for this. Iraq was in massive debt from the Iran-Iraq War in the 1980s. They had a goal of seizing vast oil resources that Kuwait had, because Kuwait's an extremely important location for oil, especially for the West. And there's also a goal to expand their regional power. They accused Kuwait of overproducing oil, stealing oil via slant drilling, and also Kuwait refused to forgive their loans that they had done for them in the Iran-Iraq War. Iraq had disputed claims that Kuwait was historically part of Iraq, and it was the 19th province, and also Saddam believed that there would be no international intervention against him. This ended up not being true. Here's another image of the conflict. There's a news broadcast from the night that it occurred. Anyways, so what's most important is the United Nations response to the invasion is what sets up the whole war. The most important part of this response is the eventual deadline that's set on Iraq for January 15th, 1991, demanding that Iraq withdraw from Kuwait, or they would use all necessary means to expel Iraq from Kuwait. And a part of this is what's known as Operation Desert Shield, which is the initial defense phase of the Gulf War. It was a coalition effort to protect or shield Saudi Arabia and neighboring countries from an Iraqi invasion. It also prepared for possible offensive and liberation. But as the January 15th deadline passed, well, Iraq did not withdraw from Kuwait. So now, you have what's known as Operation Desert Storm, which is a decisive coalition offensive against Iraq. It started with an aerial bombardment campaign that crippled Iraqi infrastructure. And then, eventually, the ground combat phase, known as Operation Desert Saber, occurs. A swift ground assault combat phase that only lasted 100 hours, and it went through February 24th to 28th. And this operation led to a ceasefire and the end of the Gulf War. Here's a kind of the imagery of this event. See all the forces, the different countries, the numbers, and you can see this left hook that occurs. That is what leads to the Iraqi retreat. The main general that oversaw this whole thing is General Norman H. Schwarzkopf, also known as Stormin' Norman. He was the commander-in-chief of CENTCOM. He led a coalition force of over 750,000 troops. He oversaw these different operations that occurred in order to get Iraq out of Kuwait, to push them back. Here's a image kind of detailing the timeline. I mentioned this just earlier. The left hook maneuver. You can see all the forces going against Iraq, and you can see these forces over here doing this left hook, which leads to the highway of death, which we'll get to in a minute. But there's an opening battle that occurs before the ground phase, the ground combat phase. It occurred in the town of Khafji, Saudi Arabia, where there's Saudi, Qatari, and U.S. Marines. The Marines more supported, and they had air support that supported these troops. They stopped an Iraqi armored incursion into the Saudi Arabian town of Khafji. You can see a couple planes that were used. That's not all of them. There was a lot more than just that. But those were some of the planes used in this conflict. And this was a part of the initial defense phase. Here, what's important to understand about the Gulf War is the aspect of tanks. The tanks are extremely important in the Gulf War. U.S. and coalition forces had over 3,000 tanks. The U.S. used the M1 Abrams tank and they still use it now. Just there's different variations of it. The Iraqi forces used a lot of downgraded and exported Soviet-made tanks, and a lot of these were inferior to the U.S. tanks, which directly leads to a lot of losses. An example of a tank battle from the Gulf War, because almost every battle was a tank battle, is the Battle of 73 Easting, decisive victory. A participant in the battle, Lieutenant John Mecca, described it as the last great tank battle of the 20th century. You see in the bottom left a destroyed Iraqi tank and some imagery from the war, specifically this battle. Here's another battle that occurred, Battle of Medina Ridge. You saw these tanks supported by air support. It was a decisive victory that destroyed 186, or at least 186 Iraqi tanks. There's another one here known as the Battle of Norfolk. It was a nighttime battle. And in this one, 850 Iraqi tanks were destroyed. One of the big differences between the tanks here is also the fact that the coalition tanks had superior coalition thermal optics, range, and GPS, which led to, especially, a lot of this was fought in more desert-like locations with all this dust coming up, and that absolutely made a difference for the coalition forces against the Iraqi tanks. And as this war comes to a close and the Iraq's forces retreat, you have what is known as the Highway of Death, where the coalition forces trapped and destroyed hundreds of retreating Iraqi military vehicles, as well as civilian ones, and most of the people in these vehicles abandoned them and ran, leaving this highway of death that just almost endless vehicles, it feels like. Just vehicle after vehicle abandoned after they were being attacked by air forces. And the goal of doing this was to stop a possible regrouping of Iraqi forces. That's just a video quickly detailing it on a map, the geography of it. And so, at the end of the Gulf War, Saddam Hussein's Iraqi forces are driven out in retreat. There's the liberation of Kuwait. And the ground combat phase, again, was a decisive 100-hour ground campaign. President George H.W. Bush declared a ceasefire that officially ended the conflict. And Iraq eventually accepts the United Nations Security Council's peace conditions. Some of these conditions were that Iraq must recognize Kuwait's sovereignty, they must destroy their weapons of mass destruction, get rid of their chemical and biological weapons stockpiles, lose their ballistic missiles with a certain range, up to 150 meters or kilometers, and that they pay war reparations. And the final payment for this was completed in January of 2022. The aftermath of the Gulf War is one of the most important ones to think of is the lack of regime change in Iraq with Saddam Hussein, his government. It kind of gave a feeling of unfinished business. This would later lead to the 2003 invasion of Iraq, which occurred during the War on Terror, which was shortly after the infamous attacks known as 9/11. And that is the Gulf War.